Good morning, everyone. It's great to see such a wonderful crowd of people here at Bard College today for our conference dedicated to the bicentennial commemoration of Abraham Lincoln. One of our goals for this let me first introduce myself. I'm Philip Kuhnhart. I'm a Bard Center Fellow. I'm the director of this conference, and I am very pleased to see you here. One of our goals for the conference was to draw together a very diverse audience made up not only of members of the college community, students and faculty, but also people in the general public and in surrounding universities and colleges, and just people in general with an interest in our 16th president. I'm interested to know how many people here today are here for the first time at Bard College. You see some hands. You can look around and you can see there are quite a few hands up. This is great. Welcome, especially to you. How many are here from other colleges in the area? I know I met a few. Yes, I see a few hands up. Welcome to you. There was to be a group from Master's School. Did you arrive? I don't see the Master's School group. What about the 11 teachers from the Red Hook High School? Are there any here? Yes, I see hands. This is a marvelous group of faculty members from local schools that are here to participate in our day. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you to Bard College for sponsoring this event, and especially to the Development Office and to my colleague and co-organizer of the conference, Mary Streeter. The name of this conference, Abraham Lincoln, Why He Still Matters, implies an answer rather than a question. Why not have called the conference, Does He Still Matter? A question that might lead to healthy debate. But that question would be a false one, I think. For more than almost any other figure in American history, Abraham Lincoln continues to matter to people. Each generation since his assassination in 1865 has looked back to his life as a kind of touchstone. Though he was hated in the South at the end of the Civil War, by 1909, the year of the Lincoln Centennial, he was widely praised even there, as a national consensus emerged around the person who has ever since been considered America's greatest president. One of the problems is that he has mattered, if anything, to too many people, as competing groups have striven to appropriate him to different purposes. But how could he belong equally, for example, to both prohibitionists and anti-prohibitionists, to both radicals and extreme conservatives, to both integrationists and segregationists? One activist in the early 20th century wrote in frustration that Lincoln, claimed by all, had come to stand for nothing. He had lost the specificity and bite of his own context. And yet, there is a poignancy to the fact of so many groups trying to claim Lincoln. No one embraced the 16th president more passionately or admiringly than did African Americans in the 1860s and in the decades after. Shut out of the centennial exercises in 1909, blacks organized their own deeply moving Lincoln commemorations. And yet by the 1960s, Lincoln's less fortunate statements about racial equality and lack thereof had been rediscovered in the popular press, and a tide of anti-Lincoln feeling washed over the African American community, bringing in a sea change which continues to be reflected in our own day. For some critical scholars, the title of this conference, Why He Still Matters, might seem blatantly hagiographical. I heard a speech just last month in Russia where a prominent sociologist portrayed Lincoln as, at best, a reluctant emancipator. And yet, Protean-like, Lincoln refuses to go away. And a spectrum of authors, including some here today, have helped place Lincoln in a richer historical context, restoring some, if not all, of his significance as great emancipator. And with Barack Obama's huge interest in Lincoln surfacing repeatedly over the past year, there is a sense that perhaps the tide is turning again. Once again, the question is not, does he still matter? The question is why? Why does he, most potently of all our past leaders, keep reemerging, especially during times of national crisis? Today, Bard College is lucky to have with us three outstanding Lincoln scholars to look into some central questions that shed light on our theme. At the 1 p.m. session, Knox College's Doug Wilson will explore the fascinating issue of Lincoln's use of written language, part of the secret of his abiding influence. At the 3 p.m. session, Professor James Oakes of the Graduate Center at CUNY will speak about Lincoln and emancipation and will outline the amazing convergence of our 16th president and his former critic, Frederick Douglass. At each of those sessions, and at the one we're about to begin, members of the Bard College History and Literature faculty will help respond to what we have heard and then participate in the general discussion. In this first panel are Christiane Crouch and Myra Armstead, esteemed members of Bard's History faculty. And Christiane will be the first respondent to the keynote address. And so our first keynote speaker of the day is Harold Holzer, co-chair of the United States Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission, and one of the most prolific of all Lincoln writers. I have known Harold for several decades. We have worked together on a number of projects, including books, historical documentaries, conferences, and exhibits. Harold is the Vice President of External Affairs at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. He's a former press secretary for Governor Mario Cuomo. He is a former executive at WNET 13 in New York. And he is a legend in the field of Lincoln studies. His book on the Cooper Union, Lincoln at Cooper Union, won the highly coveted Lincoln Prize. And his new book, Lincoln President-Elect, is the best treatment ever of the secession winter of 1860, 1861. He will speak to us this morning about Lincoln's legacy and how he has lived on in American memory. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my friend and my colleague, Harold Holzer.
Good morning, and it's thank you, Philip. It's wonderful to be here, and when we celebrate the bicentennial and analyze Lincoln memory, the contributions of the Coonhart family can't ever be far from our minds because of their contributions to the field over many generations, without which we probably wouldn't even be discussing Lincoln memory. And as a fairly new grandfather, I will add that part of the Coonhart family legacy is the book without which my grandson, Charlie Kirsch, will not go to sleep, and that is Pat the Bunny. I mean, you can't leave that out of the Coonhart family legacy. That's an important thing. See, some people don't know that, right? No, but I always remind them. I am just have to comment briefly on Philip's reminder that Lincoln is consistently rated first as greatest president, and he still is in polls of scholars. That's not quite the case anymore in popular polls, interestingly. And I can say that I was the creation of the demise of Lincoln as number one. I can't remember the name of which cable station it was. It wasn't the History Channel, but it was one of those that did national poll on the greatest president and actually set it up in a forum style with bleachers and cheerleading sections and phone-ins. And Doris Goodwin was going to be the advocate for Lincoln, and at the last minute, she canceled, and she recommended me. One can make a very nice career doing Doris's leaving, so I was very happy to do it. And the problem is that on my watch, Abraham Lincoln came in second, and Ronald Reagan came in first. I'll never forget they called Ron Reagan Jr. on the West Coast and put him on live and said, "Your father has just beaten Abraham Lincoln as the greatest president of all time." And he said, "What?" It was a really interesting moment. Actually, the latest public opinion poll shows that Reagan is indeed, even without that television program, Reagan is considered the greatest president in history, and Lincoln and Kennedy are tied for second. Chalk some of that up to the power of moving images and the inertness of the Lincoln's visual image. I'd like to think so anyway. The only other preliminary thing I'd like to say is what an honor it is to be speaking at the same conference as Jim and Doug. And just to make sure, I didn't quite hear the article you used, or the. It's very important in Lincoln Prize history. They are winners of the Lincoln Prize. I'm winners of a Lincoln Prize. You see, that's different. A Lincoln Prize means second place, but you can say a. You can't say the. It's very important. And with apologies, because also because I'm going to have to leave after my part. You may have read in this morning's New York Times that we do have some problems at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, budgetary and staff reduction issues. I have to deal with that, especially if I don't want to be one of the reductions. So I'm going to speak and then go back to New York City with apologies. I would have loved to have stayed for the whole conference. Okay, that's my preamble. Well, I want to start the official paper with a quote, appropriately enough, I guess, that the future president composed for a lecture on discoveries and inventions, which he delivered for the first time right before his 50th birthday. I'm not suggesting it's one of the greatest phrases he ever crafted, or that the lecture proved one of his greatest triumphs. In fact, if the truth be known, he never really succeeded with the lecture. He gave it in several iterations, and at one of its last iterations, it was so unsuccessful, and he's so embarrassed that he offered, very honest Abe style, to give back the 25-cent admission fee to everyone who attended. But he kept on with it. He really wanted to be a professional lecturer. That's one of the side careers he aspired to. This excerpt does live on. It's quoted often, and let me share it with you. Writing, the art of communicating thoughts to the mind through the eye, is the great invention of the world. Great in the astonishing range of analysis and combination which necessarily underlies the most crude and general conception of it. Very great in enabling us to converse with the dead, the absent, and the unborn at all distances of time and space. In a way, this whole issue of Lincoln memory is also a conversation held across all distances of time and space about the man and his complex legacy. In Lincoln memory, that organic evolutionary archive of analysis and appreciation embraces a highly diverse array of writers of many generations: journalists, biographers, satirists, essayists, novelists, clergymen, poets, playwrights, historians, memoirists, and politicians, all of whom have explored this terrain between history and folklore, memory and imagination, rhapsody and denunciation, all seeking to find the Lincoln for their time and ours. In doing this, they have inevitably and usefully, I think, provided an ever-developing portrait not only of Lincoln, but of our country as well, the nation that, after all, made Lincoln's rise possible, a rise that one can argue would not have been possible anywhere else. The nation that Lincoln saved, the nation that he helped purify of its great moral hypocrisy, human slavery, and the nation that 200 years after his birth is now remembering him anew with a kind of fervor, I think, that we haven't witnessed for a century. And I'll get into my suggestions for why that's happening later on. Now, I've spoken often about the Lincoln image. It's how I really started my Lincoln writing career, and how that image influenced his transfiguration in American memory. Today, I'm intentionally emphasizing not the pictures, but the words, and not Lincoln's words, even though I began with those, but those of others. For in the end, no man, not even a man of Lincoln's skill in both writing and politics, can forge his own place in national memory. I don't know about you, but I've lost count of the number of Lincoln books that have appeared during this Lincoln bicentennial season. I met a gentleman before we started who said he's read 5 so far this year. I didn't want to say you've scratched the surface only, but 5 is pretty good. My friend Frank Williams, who is writing a Lincoln bibliography that he can't quite seize and finish because this is such a progressive enterprise, told a newspaper recently that for the last 5 or 6 months, it's literally been at least 1, more often 2 books every week. And it continues. The annual Lincoln Prize jury recently announced that its members had waded through, I think they announced waded through, it's more like a Michael Phelpsian swimming event, I think. Maybe they had to be on the same kind of stimulants he was on too to get through it. A staggering total of 172 books, and that just ends in calendar year 2008. I think it's intensified again in what the publishers call winter '09 and spring '09. I suppose a number of writers have operated under the carpe diem theory of Lincoln scholarship, which is the conviction that now is the moment when all eyes are fixed on our subject, and it's time to get in there and compete and do lectures and books and television appearances. Our audience is hungry, and in a way we validate Walt Whitman's very well expressed awareness that, and I quote, Lincoln, his times and his death are autochtonic, meaning indigenous, native, aboriginal, wholly and distinctly American, and therefore, especially in this fascinating and unique moment of American history that we're living through, eminently worth understanding. And it's certainly not hurt the field that the bicentennial is also marked by the ascent of America's first African-American president. Without the 44th president's intervention into Lincoln memory this year, the 16th president might well be staring back at us this month, principally from the remainder bins of Barnes & Noble. That may yet be the case because of the amount of materials that are out there, but really, instead, owing in large part to Barack Obama's enthusiasm, Lincoln seems more relevant than ever to the country he saved. But of course, this is not a new phenomenon for American leaders or audiences or observers. Eulogizing the recently slain Lincoln in 1865, Emerson said of the president, who had left his native soil only once in his life, and then merely to very briefly tour the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, he was thoroughly American, had never crossed the sea, had never been spoiled by English insularity or French dissipation. A quite native Aboriginal man, as an acorn from an oak, no aping of foreigners, no frivolous accomplishments. A few months later, James Russell Lowell was emphatic in much the same manner. New birth of our soil, Lincoln was the first American. Generations later, in 2000, writer Richard Slotkin could still imagine the young hero of his novel, Abe, boasting, as only an American could, "I am Abraham Lincoln, the bull of the lick from Pigeon Creek, half horse, half alligator, and blood nephew to the meanest son of a bitch west of the mountains. The universal sky is my roof, and I stake my claim to the whole American Republic." I mean, we're invited to believe that the wrestler is also planning to become president someday. But it is true that ever since, citizens of the world have also staked their claim to him. In the years after his death, Hugo would risk censorship, even prosecution and imprisonment, by casting a commemorative medal in Lincoln's honor in defiance of Napoleon III. Tolstoy would refer to him as the greatest hero in the world. Marx would sing his praises while astonishingly criticizing his writing. Stamps and coins would be struck in his honor on nearly every continent on earth, and his admirers would come to include Churchill, Gandhi, Sun Yat-sen, Nelson Mandela, and even, interestingly, as his own union was being dissolved, Mikhail Gorbachev. But in large measure, Old World admiration responded to a New World ethos, that of the self-made man who triumphed over poverty and obscurity through hard work, relentless study, and unyielding honesty. A man of the people who dedicated himself to ensuring that others would have a fair chance to succeed in what he called the race of life. A president who bore the unimaginable burden and sorrows of leading his country through 4 years of fratricidal war while enjoying briefly the exhilaration that came with breaking the chains of slavery and saving that union. A leader who, in the hour of victory, without a trace of malice, died a martyr's death. It's really a very good story. Of course, like every mythic image built on a human history, the legend distills a more complex underlying reality. But Lincoln's endurance, sometimes as a heroic figure, sometimes as a controversial one, more often or more recently as a deconstructed one, reflects a legacy of resonance and universality. We wouldn't be here today if that wasn't so. How did it emerge? How did it evolve? And above all, as Philip asked at the beginning, why should it matter? In the beginning, Lincoln's reputation was incubated in journalism, eulogy, and political oratory. It was nurtured in biography and historical writing, and as we'll see, it's come to be revived mainly in political oratory. It was reasserted and challenged in poetry, fiction, and drama. It's been explored afresh by successive generations of writers as a renewable source for inspiration, sort of the DNA for the connective tissue that Americans still invoke to sanctify the past, to bless the present, and to imagine the future. But back to the beginning. Just 10 months after he spoke rather numbingly about writing as the art of communicating, Lincoln, the failed lecturer, became Lincoln, the successful contender for national office. And naturally, Americans wanted desperately to know all they could about him. So little was known that his first biographer desperately turned to the candidate himself for details, and Lincoln obliged by supplying the bare essentials that have been fleshed out so vigorously ever since. He sent what he called a little sketch, in which he managed to compress his entire history to date, along with a physical description, into just 4 paragraphs of text. There is not much of it, Lincoln humbly conceded, for the reason, I suppose, that there is not much of me. In his groundbreaking report, the beneficiary of that outline, that exclusive, somehow extrapolated that Lincoln was a strictly moral and temperate man, a man of frank and engaging manners, of kind and genial nature, unaffectedly modest, social in disposition, ready in conversation, a firm friend and yet not implacable to an enemy, a consistent politician, a good citizen, an honest patriot, none of which Lincoln had claimed, but the seeds of a legend were being planted. I always thought that Lincoln should have also sent, had he had access to it, the little doggerel that he wrote in one of his practice books when he was a teenager, probably, back on the prairie. I can just imagine him writing this by candlelight, and Doug and others have speculated about whether he read it and memorized it somewhere or invented it, but it's pretty good. Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen, he will be good, but God knows when. He added, this is less often quoted, but I like it too, Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I wrote it in both haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read. To be sure, no small number of fools has written about Lincoln since. That's inevitable, because no American has been the subject of more biography and hagiography, analysis and revisionism in prose and verse alike. Laudatory, of course, but Lincoln has not been immune to criticism for all these years. It's not a new phenomenon. In his own time and since, many writers assailed his character in politics, pointedly questioned Walt Whitman's view of Lincoln the Sublime. Hailed as a liberator and the savior of democracy, he's also been denounced as a tyrant and a false messiah. And as writers over time have recalled, interpreted, and debated, politicians, Republicans and Democrats alike, have sought to embrace and adapt his enduring hold on the American consciousness and to make his memory into a talisman that would bring them popular approval and electoral success. And so the Lincoln image took form through both his own words, but also through the words of other writers, a literary interaction that would continue as his own speeches and writings gained wider circulation and inspired more campaign biographies. But debate is part of memory too, and through all these attempts to mythify, Lincoln became a national sounding board as well. Lincoln memory is always something of an argument, and in fact, one of the reasons it's an argument is that Lincoln himself reflects and seems to embody many incongruous paradoxes of his character that we speak of often. After all, he's the man of sadness who also had a rollicking sense of humor, for which he was criticized in his day. And not just praised with the issuance of joke books for the campaign of 1864 that were rather a tribute to his humor, but attacked for being, for calling for a comic song on the Antietam battlefield, or mocked in a cartoon when told of the dead at Fredericksburg, "This reminds me of a little joke," which was his catchphrase that people knew about at the time. He was the commander-in-chief who was criticized alternatively as being indecisive and Hamlet-like, and also a butcher. He was the backwoods giant whose features became a haunting canvas of suffering, as big as he was, as strong as he was. The man of modesty about his homeliness, who nonetheless displayed a willingness, an eager willingness to sit for painters and sculptors and photographers, aware of the power and dissemination of his image. The Kentucky-born advocate of colonization and at one point white supremacy, maybe at all points white supremacy, who emancipated millions and eventually advocated black suffrage. A man capable of boisterous frontier repartee as well as magisterial eloquence, of steadfast honesty and sharp-elbowed political maneuvering, of compassion and derision in some of his political speeches. A man as accessible as the profile on the common penny, yet as grand as the heroic statue that sits inside the Lincoln Memorial. I think Langston Hughes, in contemplating the memorial, spoke about this incongruity when he said, "Let's go see old Abe, sitting in the marble and the moonlight, sitting lonely in the marble and the moonlight, quiet for 10,000 centuries, old Abe, quiet for million centuries, quiet and yet a voice forever against the timeless wall of time, old Abe." That Lincoln would become a subject of such enduring fascination to generations of American writers, sort of the ultimate anachronism, a quiet, loud voice through and against time, as Hughes said, could hardly have been foreseen on February 27, 1860, when he was introduced to New York by a poet and newspaper editor infinitely more famous than he was at the time, William Cullen Bryant, and then proceeded to deliver his masterful and career-altering Cooper Union address. And yet, for much of his subsequent presidency, he was criticized both publicly and privately for many, many reasons. To an actor, of all people, Abraham Lincoln once confided a wonderful comment that I think reveals a certain resignation to his character about his image at the time. "I have endured a great deal of ridicule without much malice, and have received a great deal of kindness, not quite free from ridicule. I am used to it." Whatever admiration he did win for his wartime leadership from established American writers, the definers of national reputation, mixed occasionally with condescension regarding his informal manners, his fondness for what seemed like vulgar humor, his inability or refusal to conform to established standards of presidential decorum. So the rather patronizing New England author Nathaniel Hawthorne noted after meeting him in 1862, Hawthorne was a Democrat, so that sort of colored his view of Lincoln, and he thought that the perfect president was Franklin Pierce. You know, he was good looking and he was elegant and he was dignified. He wrote, "If put to guess his livelihood, I should have taken him," this is Lincoln, not Pierce, "I should have taken him for a country schoolmaster as soon as anything else." You know, it's interesting, Pierce wrote these observations for the Atlantic Monthly in 1862 in an article called Chiefly About War Matters, and the personal description of Lincoln was considered so disrespectful that the editors, much to Hawthorne's outrage, actually censored it. And it was never published until Hawthorne's papers were published. Yet Lincoln did eventually find literary advocates, principally among anti-slavery writers like James Russell Lowell and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Stowe describing him in 1864 not only as a gifted writer and a heaven-sent leader for challenging times, but, and this is important because it's a thread that runs through everything, in the strictest sense, she said, a man of the working classes, his position now a sign to all who live by labor that their day is coming. What Gabor Borat has called the right to rise. He was the exemplar. Soon after she wrote those words came Appomattox, Lincoln's call for malice toward none, and then just 5 days later, Ford's Theater. Lincoln was shot on Good Friday, despite a bishop's request a few days later, before that he set that holy day aside for fasting and thanks to God, certainly not for a vulgar British comedy in a sinful playhouse. After the tragedy, no one seemed willing to point out that ultimate incongruity. It would be inconvenient, after all. It would be awkward to acknowledge that America's Messiah had been crucified in a Golgotha that was showing our American cousin at the time. So it was ignored, and Lincoln was moved to the Peterson House to die across the street. The first sermons preached in Lincoln's memory were heard on Easter Sunday, which coincided that year with the Jewish holiday of Passover, circumstances that greatly contributed to his apotheosis as a martyr who redeemed a suffering nation with his sacrifice, died for our sins. Edward Everett Hale and countless ministers compared Lincoln to Jesus. Henry Ward Beecher and the nation's rabbis likened him to Moses, who had led the chosen people out of bondage to within sight of a promised land he was destined never to enter himself. Lincoln had told his first biographer, "It is a great piece of folly to attempt to make anything out of my early life. It can all be condensed into a single sentence, and that you will find in Gray's Elegy, the short and simple annals of the poor. That's my life, and that's all you or anyone else can make of it." Of course, nothing he ever concluded or predicted proved so thoroughly inaccurate, but it pointed to his rise, to his ability to rise in this country, and to his innate modesty, all of which contributed to his place in national memory. Well, not surprisingly, the decades following Lincoln's death saw an outpouring of reminiscence by those who had known him. In art and literature, he immediately became acknowledged as the great emancipator, the liberator of a race. An image that was not as emphatically used in 1862 and 1863, and even in the election of 1864, except in a negative way, as an attack, and all those graphics of Lincoln as a great emancipator. One doesn't see those until 1865, as if his martyrdom had made his status as emancipator safe for popular white consumption. With the assistance of Lincoln's son Robert, his adoring secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, got exclusive access to Lincoln papers and published a 10-volume court history that stood as the enshrinement of Lincoln's reputation as a consistently wise statesman. An interesting rebuttal, or so it's been portrayed, and no one knows this story better than Douglas Wilson, came William Herndon, Lincoln's longtime Springfield law partner. Dismayed by what he saw as a tendency to idealize his friend, Herndon resolved to combine his own first-hand recollections and perceptions with what he called solid facts and well-attested truths that he gathered about Lincoln's early life from dozens of survivors who had known him in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois. After years of delay and with the help of a collaborator, Herndon's Lincoln appeared in 1889, challenging pious and sentimental views that had prevailed until then by describing Lincoln's dedication to logic and reason, his ambition, his lack of orthodox religious beliefs. Perhaps the most influential of all early Lincoln biographers, Herndon is remembered by many as a demythologizer. Yet paradoxically, he also is the source for the most romantic of all Lincoln stories, that of Lincoln's desperate early love for a doomed frontier girl named Anne Rutledge. Few legends have enjoyed such power. Lincoln's furious widow cursed Herndon for suggesting he had ever loved another woman, but his former partner had not only gotten revenge on Mary, he had etched an indelible image that seemed to explain Lincoln's persistent melancholy, and it stuck. To less immediate impact, but eventually important impact, some of the most insightful posthumous appraisals of Lincoln came from two other contemporaries, each of whom in his own way can be seen as a counterpart to Lincoln, unlikely, but I think importantly so. One was Frederick Douglass, who, like Lincoln, was a self-educated, self-made man who overcame huge obstacles to forge a public career in oratory and activism. A frequent and often harsh critic of Lincoln's administration until the Emancipation Proclamation, he described Lincoln's first inaugural, for example, as a speech from a slave catcher, because Lincoln had reinforced his view that the fugitive slave law should be enforced. Douglass became the first important African American to confer with an American president on matters of policy. Lincoln once told him there was no one in the country whose opinion he valued more. He said this in public to a group of white people who were gathered for the inaugural reception. And in turn, Douglass confided that Lincoln was, quote, "the first great man that I talked with in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded me of the difference in color." Jim Oakes has written a great deal about this relationship. When asked to deliver the oration at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial in Washington in 1876, however, a statue funded entirely by freedmen, even though it showed a slave kneeling, or some said rising, under Lincoln's outstretched hand, Douglass gave a speech on Lincoln, remarkable for candor and nuance. Describing him as preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men, Douglass assessed Lincoln's actions in the appropriate context of politics and public opinion. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, he said, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Douglass's reappraisal has provided the context and, in fact, fuel that's sometimes taken out of context for, as Philip told us, a decades-long debate over Lincoln's rightful place in the history of American freedom. Unlike Douglass, the other lion of Lincoln memory, a white man, Walt Whitman, never spoke a word with the president, though he imagined he had. He treasured his glimpses of Lincoln and wrote about them so evocatively, he even imagined that Lincoln bowed to him when he recognized him on the streets of Washington. Each was a revolutionary figure in his chosen form of writing. Whitman and Lincoln are arguably two of the great literary geniuses of 19th century. One scholar even argued recently that Lincoln's prose style magically improved after he read Leaves of Grass, although one can dispute the assertion that he actually did so. It's a little bit like reading or watching porn, I suppose, today. Lincoln, we know that Herndon had a copy, but we're not sure about Lincoln's reading it. Whitman himself seemed to realize that Lincoln had been far more profoundly influenced by an altogether different stylist, whose Civil War-torn histories and bloody tragedies he felt he was experiencing himself. As Whitman once admitted, "I should say that what Shakespeare did in poetic expression, Abraham Lincoln essentially did in his personal and official life. The invisible foundations of his character, more than any man's in history, were mystical, abstract, moral, and spiritual, while upon all of them was built and out of all of them radiated under the control of the average of circumstances, what the vulgar call horse sense, a life often bent by temporary but most urgent materialistic and political reasons." Lincoln would have loved that because he loved Shakespeare. And it's interesting that Lincoln's favorite soliloquy was not to be or not to be, although he loved Hamlet because there's too much indecision in that, but "Oh, my offense is rank," sort of a plea for understanding about real and imagined offenses in the exercise of power. With descriptions like this, plus, of course, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," which school children once memorized as relentlessly and recited as numbingly as they did the Gettysburg Address. It would not be a bad idea if that happened again in many ways. And the more profound and challenging "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed," Whitman created an enduring Lincoln of heart and sacrifice, a man who lived the new birth of freedom he described at Gettysburg and then died for it in that evocative springtime as well. But as the century drew to a close, the abandonment of Reconstruction revealed a surging desire among white Americans, perhaps latent all the while, for an end to sectional discord, even at the expense of racial equality. This surge of feeling shoved emancipation into the background of historical memory. But Lincoln survived because he was somehow refabricated. His life and martyrdom were simply recalled now as a sacrifice to North-South rapprochement, not to liberation. The desire for sectional reconciliation was expressed by, among others, Theodore Roosevelt, who as a boy had observed the mass outpouring for Lincoln's funeral rolling down Broadway in 1865. In his 1909 centennial address at Lincoln's Kentucky birthplace, Roosevelt spoke of how, as time passed, and I quote, "All of us, wherever we dwell, grow to feel an equal pride in the valor and self-devotion alike of the men who wore the blue and the men who wore the gray." The men who wore the gray. This to remember the man who, in his life, had minimized gratifying early editorial praise for the emancipation by saying he welcomed it, but breath alone kills no rebels. This was one tough guy. I think he probably was turning over in his grave at Roosevelt's words. Such writing as Roosevelt's redefined Lincoln into a rather more benign ideal, held up to every American child, especially every boy. Bayard Taylor stressed the proximity of Lincoln as a leader who dwelled within us in an 1870 picture book called The Ballad of Abraham Lincoln. His arm was strong, his heart was bold, his deeds were wise and true. He did not live in days of old, but here at home with you. By this time, generational change had begun to reshape Lincoln's legacy in other ways. Those who wrote about him were no longer contemporaries with firsthand knowledge, but persons for whom Lincoln was at best a childhood recollection, like best-selling biographer Ida Tarbell and former slave Booker T. Washington. For this new school of Lincoln image makers, Lincoln was less a person, a liberator, or a martyr than something of a force of nature, a haunting spirit forged from and part of national experience. I will add here only in passing, because I speak about it often, and the absence of this discussion might strike those who know about what my focus has been all these years, that what writers wrote about was consistently illustrated by artists, and I use that word illustrated rather too glibly here because artists did more than add visual context to the written word. They invented a pivotal genre of memory themselves. In Lincoln's own time, Lincoln decorated their homes with pictures of political figures like Lincoln in the manner of religious icons of old. Later, when the taste for these pictures faded, Lincoln assumed a more monumental place in art, first as the hero of civic tributes in marble and bronze that emphasized his role as emancipator, later morphing when it seemed more appealing again to de-emphasize his work in altering American race relations, into a national icon symbolizing such generic virtues as opportunity, honesty, and firmness. Here's an example. Since the 1870s, the statue of Lincoln in the Capitol Rotunda can still be seen clutching an emancipation scroll, but not as overtly as it once did. Workers actually thought that the statue had lived out its usefulness and tried to remove it around the turn of the century. It was always controversial. It had been done by a very young artist. But accidentally, they broke the document in his hand. Then they decided to leave it where it stood, fearful of doing more damage. When it was repaired, the new scroll that once said Emancipation bore no inscription at all. It could have been Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, his Cooper Union speech, or his laundry list, for that matter. The great painting, Lincoln's reading of the first of the Emancipation Proclamation, was dedicated to the United States Congress in 1876. And yet, almost no one who spoke at that joint session of Congress emphasized emancipation. They emphasized union building and union saving. The principal speaker for the occasion was the man who had rejected Lincoln's call to help him rally union support in the South and ultimately went on to become vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Hamilton Stevens. There was an irony at work here. Lincoln once said to an artist that if he were ever remembered in history, it would be for the proclamation. But when race relations became too tense for comfort, Lincoln was remembered instead just for preserving the Union or for something more, for symbolizing the Union. Thus followed a generation of sculptures that seemed to rise above specific accomplishments, but more specifically maybe avoided them. The emancipator clutching his scroll was succeeded by the seated giant inside the Greek temple on the Washington Mall, who only later became the backdrop for transformative events in race history like Marian Anderson's 1939 concert and the March on Washington in 1963. The passage of time also affected Lincoln's role in politics. Until the end of the 19th century, he was the exclusive property of Republicans. When William Jennings Bryan, for example, tried claiming Lincoln for populist Democrats, the Republican press reacted as if Lincoln was being assassinated again, even the New York Times. Fortunately for the Republicans, TR became perhaps the most ardent Lincoln admirer ever to sit in the presidential chair. For luck, he wore a ring containing a lock of Lincoln's hair that had been given to him by his Secretary of State, John Hay, who had been Lincoln's assistant private secretary in the White House. And of course, he listened to stories that Hay spun about Lincoln. He once said, "Whenever I feel that I have a big decision to make, I turn and I look at my portrait of Lincoln and I know what to do." Dangerous words, maybe. Of course, when Roosevelt spoke of Lincoln, he often described a man who sounded very much like Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive nationalist, a practical reformer who followed his own course despite criticism from both radicals and conservatives. In 1912, he and his handpicked successor, with whom he'd broken, President Taft, battled for Lincoln's legacy in that famous three-way election. Taft even trumped Roosevelt by going up to Manchester, Vermont, to secure Robert Lincoln's endorsement for president. And one of the great early Lincoln-related photo opportunities in presidential history, as famous as Adlai Stevenson rubbing Lincoln's nose in 1952 for luck. It turned out to be bad luck, but for luck. Taft played golf with Robert Lincoln. But both men lost, of course, to Woodrow Wilson, who promptly claimed Lincoln's mantle for the Democrats, again in his own image. His Lincoln was a global enforcer of democracy. He made that comparison often. The run-up to World War I, even as Wilson unapologetically imposed Jim Crow segregation on the federal bureaucracy. The grim reality of entrenched segregation and racial violence in the early 20th century, of course, tested African American loyalty to the Republican Party and its greatest symbol. A vicious race riot exploded in 1908 in Lincoln's old Springfield, Illinois hometown, of all places, inspiring a so-called Lincoln Conference on the Negro Question, which in turn inspired the founding of the NAACP, whose centennial is being observed this year in New York City. A decade later, W.E.B. Du Bois used the pages of the NAACP magazine The Crisis to speak with new frankness about the complexities of Lincoln's record on race and slavery. Du Bois restated a case for qualified admiration, saying that he revered Lincoln because, up out of his contradictions, he fought his way to the pinnacles of earth, and his fight was within as well as without. As Du Bois put it, he was big enough to be inconsistent, one of the great quotes about Lincoln ever uttered. Cruel, merciful, peace-loving, a fighter, despising Negroes and letting them fight and vote, protecting slavery and freeing slaves. He was a man, a big, inconsistent, brave man. End quote. That mysterious anachronism again. Always capable of change, as if to remind contemporaries that we can change. We can be forgiven for past sins or misdeeds or shortcomings and move on. Sharper were the cruel ironies unleashed by the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. At a ceremony at which African American spectators were herded rather cruelly with vicious epithets hurled at them by white soldiers, herded into a segregated area at the very back of the crowd, Chief Justice Taft, he was then Chief Justice, gave an address that never mentioned slavery. Warren Harding, the president, assured the audience that Lincoln saw emancipation only as a measure to preserve the Union. Then it was the turn of Robert Moton, successor to Booker T. Washington, as principal of the Tuskegee Institute. He was chosen to speak on behalf of his race, and he drafted a speech that warned that the memorial would prove but a hollow mockery, a symbol of hypocrisy, unless the nation rededicated itself to the pursuit of justice and equality. But he submitted his draft to the event's organizers and was told to mute his criticism. He did so. He had no choice. His original draft was not spoken. Of course, no writer did more to shape the memory of Lincoln in the first half of the 20th century than a rather more uncensored and blander writer, Carl Sandburg. In prose and poetry alike, Sandburg shrunk the Lincoln Memorial down to size, if you will, viewing Lincoln as an accessible tribune of the common people, a faithful son of the democratic frontier whose example would always remind Americans of their duty to confront tyranny and injustice, a Lincoln for the 20s and 30s. You can agree or disagree with Edmund Wilson's famous assessment that Sandburg created the worst violence on Lincoln than anyone since John Wilkes Booth, or you can look at the Pulitzer Prize, the best-selling status, and the influence. He was extremely influential, and his influence could be seen in very real political terms, even though Sandburg himself decided he would run for the Senate seat that Abraham Lincoln had vied for in Illinois, and he was probably astonished to be red-baited out of that race, by the way. It's an interesting sidebar to the story. But his influence can be seen in Abe Lincoln in Illinois, the hugely successful and influential play and movie by Robert E. Sherwood, both starring Raymond Massey, as everyone remembers. Lincoln was a friend of the working man who very reluctantly seeks office, has to be begged to meet his destiny in order to confront inescapable evil, in this case, slavery. It was the perfect hero for an isolationist country moving from the New Deal toward a perilous confrontation with fascism. Not surprisingly, FDR decided to hire Sherwood as a speechwriter, and President Roosevelt, in turn, became the Democrat who finally broke the Republicans' stranglehold on both Lincoln memory and African American voter support. Roosevelt recruited Lincoln as an advance ally in the looming battle against the Axis. Sherwood and FDR alike helped forge a new aesthetic. Lincoln is the man who had to be prodded into action, but once roused, saved the nation, this reluctant warrior Lincoln. And it fit the moment perfectly, even if few who had known or who understood the relentlessly ambitious Lincoln would have recognized this counter myth of the reluctant leader introduced so many years after his death. Roosevelt's claim on Lincoln has been reasserted by Democrats ever since, most notably, I suppose, Mario Cuomo, for whom, as Philip said, I worked, but Newt Gingrich has battled for a share of his legacy too, stressing Lincoln's treasured conservatism, as if the term meant then what it has come to mean since. But Lincoln has always served as a looking glass for American leaders, particularly presidents, and this can be good and this can be bad. When people ask me, as they do often, do I think President Obama has overstated his connectedness to Lincoln? Is it a bad thing? I said, would you rather he was aspiring to emulate Calvin Coolidge or Warren Harding? I mean, Lincoln is a good person to admire, don't you think? But Lyndon Johnson saw Lincoln as a president besieged unfairly by critics, very much like Lyndon Johnson, as did Richard Nixon, who, as we all know, not just from the movie, but from reality, resorted to secret midnight visits to the Lincoln Memorial to seek refuge and sustenance. In more recent years, Bill Clinton came to view Lincoln as a man who sought to tug extremes toward the center to achieve a middle ground, sort of a Clinton-esque triangulator. And George W. Bush tried justifying his own extraordinary use of executive powers in wartime by saying, Lincoln made me do it. Lincoln has become not only a prism refracting the American experience, but a mirror in which our leaders see themselves, for better or worse. On a parallel track, Lincoln's image in the African American community has taken its own unexpected turns. Dr. King began his speech to the March on Washington by invoking this great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today. It was the 100th anniversary of emancipation, after all. But 5 years later, Lerone Bennett Jr., a senior editor at Ebony, rhetorically asked, was Lincoln a white supremacist? And then answered in the affirmative, unequivocally. Bennett sought not only to challenge accepted history, but to free readers from what he considered a profoundly misleading mythic inheritance. In doing so, interestingly, seldom discussed, he sort of transformed an anti-Lincoln tradition that had previously existed robustly, but had been defined by white writers who blamed Lincoln for the destruction of state sovereignty, the ascendancy of industrial capitalism, and the triumph of militant American nationalism, complaints that Ron Paul revived during the 2008 presidential campaign, making Lincoln the whipping boy for libertarians. I don't know if you remember that famous Meet the Press interview where Ron Paul said maybe slavery could have existed in this country for another 100 years because to have tolerated it would have saved all those lives and kept the national government from growing and taxing people. But Bennett's critiques also marked a new stage in the distinct African American tradition of Lincoln memory that had quietly evolved until then alongside the white tradition. The memory of how emancipation had delivered only partial liberation became a measure of how much Lincoln and the democracy he represented and exemplified had withheld from those who sought the full measure of freedom. So now here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. And in critical and imaginative writing alike, Lincoln is showing renewed vitality. Bookstores, as long as they last, I suppose in 10 years I'll be saying Kindle screens, as long as they last, are alive with Lincoln literature. As we speak, by the way, playwright Tony Kushner is hard at work on his 38th draft of, I'm exaggerating but only slightly, of his screenplay for Steven Spielberg. And I think a film will go in production eventually with Liam Neeson becoming the screen Lincoln for our own generation. First, Liam Neeson is going to play Zeus, so we'll see. He may be ready for Lincoln after Zeus. But the most surprising turn in all of the recent course of Lincoln memory has come, I argue, in the world of politics. On February 10th, 2007, 2 days before Lincoln's 198th birthday, another Illinois politician, like Lincoln, describing himself as a tall, skinny lawyer who had served for only 8 years in the state legislature, stood outside the Springfield State House, where Lincoln had worked, across the square from the site where he delivered his first lecture on discoveries and inventions in 1859, and where he wrote his inaugural address in 1861, and announced his candidacy for President of the United States. Barack Obama did not hesitate to imply that his election would do much to complete the unfinished work Lincoln had acknowledged at Gettysburg. His evocation of Lincoln as he began his quest for the presidency testified anew to Lincoln's astonishing durability as a symbol of aspiration and expectation. It reaffirmed Lincoln's place as the permanent, irresistible totem of American hope. This is what Barack Obama said, some of what he said on Lincoln's birthday, '07. By ourselves, change will not happen. Divided, we are bound to fail, but the life of a tall, gangly, self-made Springfield lawyer tells us that a different future is possible. He tells us there is power in words. He tells us there is power in conviction. That beneath all the differences of race and region, faith and station, we are one people. He tells us there is power in hope. Together, standing today, let us finish the work that needs to be done and usher in a new birth of freedom on this earth. As we know, President Obama dedicated his inaugural as 44th president to the 16th president in small and large ways. He swore his oath on the borrowed Bible on which Lincoln placed his hand at the same ceremony nearly a century and a half before. He made a journey to Washington by train that replicated the end of Lincoln's meandering journey in 1861, and more to the point, did it triumphantly in the part of the journey that Lincoln did secretly. In doing so, Barack Obama has rather single-handedly transformed Lincoln memory and harnessed the power to discuss it, preserve it, and enhance it in years to come. No doubt the future will bring further shifts in how we see Lincoln and through him ourselves. There will always be something more to be said, to be written. The conversation across all distances of time and space will continue. We're all ready to welcome it and learn from it. I think it's fascinating that we meet the day after President Obama gave yet another Lincoln speech in dedicating a portrait of Lincoln and renaming a room at a military installation for Lincoln. He unveiled a replica of the portrait of Lincoln that hangs in the East Room of the White House. I'm sure you've all seen it, Lincoln leaning on his hand and knee. The iconography of that portrait shows how we've broadened our Lincoln. Because the original portrait is of Lincoln, Sherman, Grant, and David Dixon Porter. The portrait of Lincoln alone, which is taken right from that painting, is not a model for the group. It's what the artist decided Americans would prefer. Not a military setting, not a specific setting, not a rainbow breaking out to symbolize peace or military men discussing war, but Lincoln alone, contemplating our national mirror. That's why Lincoln memory matters. And he'll matter to future presidents and future leaders because he's there to guide us. He's there to be an integral part of the national discussion. As an anonymous poet from the Depression, the last Depression, that is, expressed it in words that I think seem as relevant today as they were then, and I would like to close with this little verse. Consider the land of thine and freedom's birth. Cry out, it shall not perish from the earth. Engrave upon our hearts that holy vow, Spirit of Lincoln, thy country needs thee now. Thank you very much.
We have Harold with us for another 25 minutes, but first we'd like to hear a response from Christian Crouch, a brief response, and then we're going to have a chance for you to ask Harold some questions before he leaves, following which we will continue for another half hour until the noon hour, in which we'll continue this discussion of Lincoln and American memory. So our next speaker is Christian Crouch.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference, and especially Philip Kuhnhart, for bringing such wonderful keynote speakers and really engaging this forum. It is an incredible honor for me to be able to give any sort of response for such a wonderful paper. Harold Holzer has done a marvelous and impressively concise job at tracing the genesis of Lincoln in American memory over time and in different communities. In his paper, he shows us the relevance of the man, the president, the icon, and the image for a broad and changing American public. He highlights the propitious moment that united the bicentennial with a historic inauguration, and that brings together the multiple strands that he has outlined in American history. I'll keep my comments here brief because I am eager to hear the broader discussion. But let me simply begin by saying that my historical training is as an early modern Atlanticist. I can make no special claims to be a Lincoln scholar, nor am I a student of the 19th century United States. However, I do think that this background enables me to say a few words regarding Lincoln and American memory from an Atlantic and international perspective as a counterpoint to the earlier paper. And let me relate this mostly in the form of an anecdote. My grandmother was Ethiopian, a barely literate businesswoman, very successful, who had never traveled outside the confines of the Horn of Africa until 1997, when she came for her first visit to the United States. She spoke 5 regional languages, but not English, and she brought with her a particular worldview that did not match that of 20th century technology and information-saturated America. Upon her arrival in Washington, D.C., which is where my family lives, we tried to acclimate her to navigating the basics of being a tourist in the U.S., including an introduction to U.S. currency and coinage. Ishi, Lincoln, she said when she saw the penny, and then addressed a few more words to my mother in Amharic. What did she say? I asked, curious as to what had piqued her interest. My grandmother, like almost everyone else in the world, knew who Lincoln was, but I wasn't sure that she knew why she had heard of him. She knew about George Washington, and I was quite sure she had no idea why he was historically relevant to Americans. My mom laughed a little bit before responding and translating. She says, yes, Lincoln, what a great man. His face is still on the money all these years after his reign has ended. I was amazed. I had never really thought about the penny that way. But to someone who grew up in a developing nation where Maria Theresa's silver sovereigns are still legal rural currency, the longevity of money's value is indeed a statement on the lasting political legacy and trust of the individual who is portrayed on that coin. As Americans, we may not think twice about Lincoln on our penny, where he has been since 1909, and it is our most common denomination. It is ironic that this symbol that is so central to the American dream, as it is understood globally, made its entrance at the height of Jim Crow segregation. Did my grandmother understand why Lincoln was on the money? Why he was, in her eyes, a great king? Well, indeed she did. Ethiopia, too, had been a society of unfree labor, a society with slaves that was unlike the slave society of the U.S. South, but one that could nonetheless understand the radical step of emancipation and the importance of memory. If we consider Lincoln as an American export, then, perhaps we gain a greater understanding of his memory, at least to those who live elsewhere. In an era where American goods, finance, and values circulate in a global market, Lincoln has a dual role. Lincoln is the president who presided over an internationalizing and transnational America that included Mexicans, Indians, people of African and European descent, transnational connections, and recognitions of new countries. The penny is the beacon of a state that now joined a community of progressive nations committed to commerce and exchange, unfettered by unfree labor. The national divisions that we have over Lincoln's memory as a unifier, constitutional conservative, maybe, advocate or foe to states' rights, racist or not, have not disseminated around the Atlantic or the Pacific in the same way. The other role that Lincoln's international memory serves to remind us is that overseas, Lincoln is remembered for the fundamental act of being an individual who engaged a great question of the human condition, something that is accessible to the literate and the not, the rural and the urban. How to bring about a right to correct a wrong. Thank you.
It is 11:15, and we have a little time now for audience participation and for group discussion. I believe there is a wireless mic. Is that correct? Is Dennis here to help us with that? If not, if it doesn't arrive in time, I'm going to ask you, if you have a question, just to stand and speak it out quite clearly so we can hear. And I invite any questions to begin with. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. During Mr. Holzer's remarks, it occurred to me to ask your panelists to consider another white man that Frederick Douglass collaborated with in the remarks today. Lincoln's done well, and as his myth has grown. John Brown, his myth has shrunk. He's become the parody of all that's evil, as Lincoln has become the parody of all that's great. So I just put that other name out there. Perhaps he can, looking from that other vantage point, can give us some more depth on the public relations miracle that's President Lincoln.
Harold, would you like to respond first to that, and then perhaps Myra would like to say something?
I'm inclined to look at it through the prism of the 19th century first. And of course, America, after the Revolution, has more of a tradition of nonviolence than violence for change. So Brown was a frightening experience for white America, even in the North, except for the abolitionist sector that had funded him and supported him. But he certainly was a hero in his time, as you point out. He's, and nothing could better point to the transfiguration and the transposition that you attest to than that a song that had been so familiar about John Brown was immediately co-opted in 1861, on November 19th, 1861, to be precise, by Julia Ward Howe when she made the Battle Hymn of the Republic into a Lincoln. I mean, it was really not about Lincoln, but it became sort of Lincoln's theme song, like the Tonight Show theme song was for Johnny Carson. I think that Brown is sort of getting a re-examination, but again, violent people who to advocate radical violent change are not usually celebrated in American culture for a long time, and I guess that's the best answer I can give. I just want to thank Christian for being the first person in 30 years of lecturing who ever called me concise. I consider this a major day for me.
Myra, can I call on you to have a few words on this topic?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Harold said, that Americans are notoriously uneasy with violence, despite the fact that we came into being through a revolution. I'm thinking of a particular text that I teach sometimes called The Shoemaker and the Revolution. And it's a rereading of the Boston Tea Party, which we see as so central an event in the American Revolution, but it took many decades before the American Revolution became, I'm sorry, the Boston Tea Party could even be accepted as a, part of the narrative of the revolution. For many years, it was just called the destruction of the tea. And the very cautious founders of the country were quite leery of moving this event into the center of the narrative of the American Revolution because it was potentially destabilizing. So, I mean, John Brown is totally frightening.
A very good question. How do reputations evolve over time so that somebody who could have been a giant figure and widely admired in some quarters at least become reviled in a later era? And there's shifting reputations of various individuals over time. It makes a fascinating study. There's a field called that of reputational entrepreneurship. And the sense that people's reputation rises and falls on the basis of their biographers. You can see a huge spike in interest in Harry Truman after the David McCullough biography, for example, in terms of his reputation. Big subject. Yes, sir, I'll call on you next. There is a microphone. This young woman is going to bring it over.
I have a what-if question, which I'm sure has been asked many times in many contexts. What if Lincoln had lived? And we do know in some ways what his Reconstruction plans were, such as the speech he gave the night after the surrender from the White House window, or even his words in his second inaugural. But if he had lived, and also the experience that almost every president who served a second term
really had, whatever fame they had in their first term went downhill in their second term. And if he had lived, what would have happened in Reconstruction, and might he even have been tried for impeachment as Johnson was?
Mm-hmm. Because we have Harold here so briefly, I'd like him to begin the response.
Okay. Again, with the caveat that it's terribly speculative and none of us really likes to do it, you're right, it's a question that gets asked a lot. And I think I've gone back and forth on this, but I think in the end, based in part, or based largely on that last speech in which Lincoln introduced the idea of black suffrage, even though he limited it to the very educated, as he put it, and those who have served in our ranks. Sounds like a means test, but it's the first time an American president had publicly expressed a desire to see people of color enfranchised. And you know who was in the audience? John Wilkes Booth. And he turned to one of his co-conspirators and said, that means Negro citizenship, not using the word Negro, to be sure, and that's the last speech he'll ever give. 3 nights later, he shot Lincoln, giving it a political aspect that I think has only begun to be recognized recently. I think that, Lincoln liked to move slowly. He liked to have public opinion at his back. He once said public opinion is more important. Someone who can move public opinion is more important than someone who can enact statutes. It's hard to say, but it's important. He gave the impression, even with emancipation, which to the detriment of his historical legacy and his reputation, I think, that he was prodded into it, that he was reluctant, that he was sort of being dragged into something he had always hoped would happen, kicking and screaming, because last resort.